How Dead Space was killed by executive decision making.
So you know those times where it really looks like a game should be good, but then it comes out and it very much isn't? That's what happened to the Callisto protocol. Like, in many ways, that thing...
I don't know. I remember looking at the Callisto Protocol trailer and I was thinking to myself, this seems more Call of Duty than Dead Space in some regards.
looked impressive, but it basically didn't really feel like a finished game. Funnily enough, that might actually be because it wasn't a finished game. And if true, executive meddling directly murdered it. Now, the game came out in 2022, it had a muted reception, it had, I would say, relatively low sales, especially compared to what the execs actually wanted. The run-up to launch was a little bit suspicious. I mean, you had the director talking about crunch, which is never a good sign because it usually means that something has not went to plan. When the game came
Whenever I hear about crunch, I instantaneously know what's the true issue. That the developers are not really good at their job. For example, let's take Amazon Gaming Studios. Yeah, they haven't made anything good, and New World, well, you can argue that New World actually did not come out with more bugs than your triple A slop nowadays. But you know what's the interesting thing about Amazon Game Studios? Crunch doesn't exist. Why? Because they have an actual structured way to make games and whatnot. How many times at this point have I heard these stories about, okay, let's start developing a game, and we have 5 years to deliver on this game, and the first 2 years, roughly, nothing happens. No one does any real work and no progress is made. And then at the end, everyone has to crunch because they just didn't do anything for the first 2 years of the game's development. Whenever I hear that crunch is a problem, I instantaneously default to these developers are incompetent, their graphics are complete trash, and they have no absolute structure of, well, doing anything, honestly. And that seems to be true.
Came out, well, what we basically had was technical problems, design issues, and it just didn't land in the way that the studio striking distance intended. Now, though, things get a little bit fun because we get to ask the question, what if it had came out when it was actually meant to? What if it came out in the way that the developer actually intended? Yeah, this is a weird story, and I'm going to ask you for just 15 seconds. If you're new around here, we've had loads of new viewers lately. Could you please give the subscribe button a click? And the reason I say that's really simple. It gives YouTube a positive... With that said,
very cool.
Callisto Protocol. Now, I want you to keep something in mind here. Callisto Protocol came out on the 2nd of December 2022. Now, that's a really weird release date, and it's certainly one that American companies within the games industry try not to do. It's generally too late, it's too close to Christmas, it's competing with loads of other consumer spending. It's a little weird when a AAA game, I mean, certainly one...
I mean, that's one take, but then again, there's the opposite take where companies specifically try to lease it on Christmas because there's hype around it and everyone's gonna buy it as a gift. So, yeah, takes like this, they always have the flip side, and the flip side is as valid as, well, the first side.
With a budget like this one comes out at that time. Do keep that in mind because it's going to be relevant soon. Now, what's happened is an interview with Glenn Schofield from Dan Allen Games, and this has revealed that after a really great start, the relationship between Krafton and Striking Distance became adversarial and demanding, and ultimately, that is what kind of ruined things for the game. The most important and almost certainly the most damaging thing is the release...
Okay, when a situation like that happens and the relationship between two companies sours, that is typically because of the executives. Because, pro tip for anyone who's in the workplace, you being good at your job is sometimes even less than 50% of you actually being good at your job, but it's you convincing other people that what you want, what you need, what you do, and how you think is correct. And that is by far the biggest thing that you need to know.
Date was promised at one point to be in 2023, but was then moved up by 3.5 months. So can you imagine working on a project that's scoped to like 1.5 years or a year and just losing 3.5 months? That is absolutely goddamn insane. So here's the quote. It actually was in October or September of 2021. I was told, quote, "You're going to get the time, just no regrets." That was the term that kept being used. No regrets, just put whatever you want into the game. And so that ends up being being the plan for the next while. Glenn goes on to say that he just worked on that over his Christmas vacation, that he was designing, coming up with other ideas and things like that. But then, well, what happens is he comes back to work in January, and Krafton basically say, no, actually, you're not releasing in 2023. You are releasing in December of 2022. And that means that in January 2022, Callisto Protocol went from having 15 and a half months of development left to only having 12 months. That's basically losing 20% of the planned development time. We've all...
Yes, exactly. And if you're not a moron, you can actually make that work. That's the reality of this situation. You can make that work. Wow.
Played games that feel 80% done. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that happens. Anyway, what Schofield says, though, is this isn't a case where you can just remove time from the equation and end up with the same result. You've got to balance things out. Like, to risk oversimplifying things, it's the core principle that if, say, one dressmaker will make you a dress in 9 weeks, but if that's to say you want the dress in 1 week, maybe you're going to need 9 dressmakers. Just that, of course, in reality, it's worse than that.
By the way, anyone remember the premises of this? One guy just goes insane, and there you go. Now there's a bunch of machines that spin and grind meat. That was pretty much the story of this game.
Because while, yes, you may need 9 dressmakers, perhaps you'll also need, I don't know, 2 managers, HR, and all the other things to support that team, the layers of management. So it's one of those challenging things if you want...
I have no idea why he's saying that HR needs to be involved in this. HR doesn't... What is HR gonna do? Help you design how you're gonna do things at what point? No. Why is HR even important here? I don't get it.
Something to happen in a compressed space of time, you are going to need a larger team. But the larger your team gets...
Okay, yeah. Hiring more people, I guess that's fine, but that's what HR typically does, so this is not even pulling them out of their, circle.
The less efficient it ends up being, the more that you risk things like talent dilution, and the more that you then need to bake in inefficiencies in the form of process to actually get things working, because, scale is basically inherently a nightmare. So, with all of this in mind, Glenn tells Krafton that they're not going to save any money from this delay because he's just going to need 30 to 40 more people to actually make the new timeline work. But basically Krafton just pressed on because this was actually not about saving money for them. We'll get on to why later, and of course you've also got to remember this is all 2021, and
all of this seems like a bunch of mistakes, but not just from their side, from both sides.
Things are going on in 2021 that maybe would have reduced team efficiency. So what ended up happening is they were getting cut to pieces and they weren't getting support from Krafton. What Glenn says is this: you have a studio of 200 to 250 people. 10 to 20 people a month were getting sick, and they were getting sick for weeks, right? We were devastated. Sometimes our whole department of visual effects would be out. Our animation department, And when he basically says that he'd call Korea about these sorts of things, it just wasn't really taken seriously.
Oh, yeah, it's Korea. Well, why would they care?
So that's quite rough. Now, of course, there was another big change in 2021 in the games industry. The change that, of course, has resulted, or at least partially resulted, in nearly 12,000 layoffs in just this 1 year. And that is that games looked like an amazing investment opportunity during the pandemic. People were locked up at home, way more video games were being played, and that just led to surging revenues and a little bit of a speculative bubble being popped up. So what would happen is loads of these companies would become flush with cash, and they would start offering real absurd salaries, like really, really big ones. Glenn quoted 110 grand while working from home. Now, the problem that this would have posed for someone like Striking Distance is, well, they're a smaller team with less clout. That ended up being a really big challenge, because you got to remember, it's not only the big companies, poaching staff off each other, it's also there being like a lot of startups that were getting a lot of investment. I mean, as an example, and this is definitely one of the higher up ones, but I actually heard of Senior Animation, somebody basically losing a prospect to that because they were given an offer that was like well north of 300 grand. So that's challenging, and Glenn says,
I mean, that's annoying, and yes, these things probably sound not that complicated or hard, but they kind of actually are. This is probably one of the real bigger issues, because if you're low on workforce and you can't get workforce, well, there's a lot of problems with that. Again, this is probably something that you could do, but actually having a structured, team, an idea how you're gonna do everything. Man, you know those those pictures that look like they're drawn by a 3-year-old that have their structures. You have your CEO, then you have your department heads, then the department splits into branches. Everyone has, yeah. Maybe these companies should actually get a 3-year-old to draw them up. Functioning company design or something like that. Maybe that would help them, because all of this sounds still manageable. Very annoying, especially the part where there's not enough people to employ. But then again, 300K for some kind of animation or VFX or whatever position, that's a lot, obviously, but that's probably one person in an industry with thousands of people. Okay, people move from company to company to company to company, and at the end of the day, the only thing that they care is primarily how much they're gonna get paid, obviously, and then that's pretty much it. Now, if you're working on a game that actually has, a good name, a big name, and you want to be a part of that because that's better for your future, okay. But something like a Dead Space spin-off or whatever the hell the Callisto Protocol was, that's fine. That's pretty big. People would probably want to work on that. I mean, this sounds really bad the way that he's describing this, but it's not that bad, because keep in mind, in that time period, indie development companies still were pumping out games, and they weren't complaining about everything going to hell. Well, some companies always complain about everything going to hell, but still, these are issues that can be solved with just good management.
That they had 49 people quit because of this in 2021, and it's what Glenn anyway calls the Great Resignation. So all of this was going on. I think you can imagine it's not great. They've lost months of their schedule. Their team keeps on, having sickness and that kind of thing. And they're also having loads of people quit. And that's all in an environment where hiring is really hard because there's a lot of money just around the system. Yet through all that, they were able to hit their deadline on the 2nd of December. And, well, it really does suck. Why? Basically, they cut 2.5 bosses from the game, 3 or 4 different enemy types as well, and they were doing all of this while they were trying to finish the game on time. And that meant...
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, this game would not have been saved by 2 more bosses where your basic mechanic of dodging is whoop, 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 whoop. If you haven't seen that video about Callisto Protocol, you should. It is hilarious.
Meant that they had to cut things for the sake of speed, but they weren't really able to make the design fully work, as it was, of course, intended at the start of 2022. And that was very much spoken for in the reviews, where
I would say the game mechanics just in general were just not appealing.
Yes, there was performance issues, stuff like that we're maybe a bit more used to, but then just design...
I'm sneezing like crazy, boys.
Design decisions that felt odd. Things that felt just really half-baked, not really that well-conceived. And it turns out that by the end of 2021, all of these things were probably quite well-conceived. Problem, of course, was they lost time and they had loads of issues. They ended up on OpenCritic having a 67 average and a 42% recommendation, which is obviously not great. Some stuff was then chalked up to just sort of, the DLC will come in and make a lot of things better, and that just didn't really...
Wait, there was no DLC, right?
Really happen. Now, the first signs of all this that we got was crunch. Basically, they crunched it, and Glenn basically said that he was proud of the team. That's one of those things where I do understand how, at the time, right, you basically have Glenn being like, yep, we have had to do so much crunch to make this happen, and I'm really proud of the team. And then people are basically saying, well, that's probably bad. You've probably burnt out all your staff. Why are you proud that you managed your game poorly, that you managed your schedule poorly and burned everybody out? That seemingly is silly. And of course, he will then say, well, here's all of this context, which we can now talk about today. I mean, as an example, at the time,
the context doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you still mismanage your teams at the, extremely poorly and whatnot. Again, 3 months less to finish a game is not the end of the world unless you have like 4 months to make and finish the game. It's not. It's manageable. It should be manageable. Maybe you should be. I can bet This is one more story where at the beginning, the first 4 months of development, nothing really happened and everyone's just sitting on their asses.
This is what Jason Schreier tweeted in response. This, from a studio head, is crunch culture defined. Of course, nobody is forced to work insane hours, but imagine the reduced bonuses and lack of promotion opportunities if you don't. You do it because you love it. Weaponized passion, this is why people burn out of gaming. You can totally understand what he's saying there. The challenge here, though, is, well...
You know who's getting the bonuses, by the way, if you're doing crunch? Not you. You worthless worm, okay? If you agree to crunch, you have not made anything better for you. In fact, you probably have made it worse. Because if you do crunch one time now, well, now you have to do it every single time again. And you know who's gonna get the promotion? Your boss, who's gonna be, oh yeah, I made these people work. And their bosses are gonna be like, now that's the guy that we need, the one that can make the poor worms work. Yeah, you're not making anything better in your life by spending 15 hours a day working and coding and blah blah blahing as a game developer, okay? Your boss is gonna reap all those rewards. Well, he's probably leaving after 8 hours like a normal person. If you agree to crunch, you're an idiot.
Well, the context maybe changes things. You can totally understand why Schofield would be proud, right? Like, you can get Jason's logic, yeah.
And you know who your boss is gonna promote from the people that did the crunch? Probably the guy he just likes the most. Nothing to do with skill, nothing to do with hours put in. Probably the guy who just licks his asshole better.
Yes, but the reason why Schofield is proud is probably because he knows they have been dealt a stupidly shit hand, and it's basically a miracle that they ended up shipping the game, so he's going to be proud at how the team were able to come together. Even though, of course, yes, they'll have been burning the candle at both ends, almost certainly to the point of creating, you know, burnout and all of those bad things that end up just undermining the long-term viability of a studio. So it's really a case of Striking Distance being under insane pressure from Krafton and them just being, you know, backs up against the wall and being forced to deliver. And of course, they had to deliver because if they didn't, they would lose their jobs, hence the crunch happening. Now, some people will relish the challenge, and I know, like, in terms of personality type, I would generally be one of those. Like, if you say to me, okay, this is going to be shit, but welcome to 3 months of hell, there is a large part of me that will think, hell yeah, let's do this. The problem, though, is that is not always wise, and you end up just kind of hurting yourself.
Dude, how are we supposed to get good games when the game developers don't understand anything and fail at the most basic part of being a human?
In the process, so there's always a balance. And it's fair to say,
again, I have said this once, I'll say it again, because people need to understand, hear it, and do it. You breaking your back for a company is gonna not even net you a thank you at the end. When you become a problem, they're gonna let you go. And the fact that you slaved for free, did this and that, is not gonna matter at all. You're gonna be the loser because you don't understand that, the fact that the company is not your family or some bullshit like that. You are an employee, and if you waste time on crunch, that's on you, buckaroo.
Say that I'd probably find that to be quite easy to do because, like, this is the channel that I've built. And one of the follow-ups from Jason actually is quite strong, where he basically says it's easy to mistake obligation for enthusiasm when you happen to be the guy who controls all their salaries, titles, and current employment status. So you can definitely see Schreier's point. It does seem scathing, it also does seem fair, but if you think about it from the perspective of, like, Schofield and Striking Distance, well, they literally had no choice because of the pressures that they were getting from Krafton. So you then end up in a situation that's all about pragmatism. That basically is your limitation. Perhaps you're not going to get more staff, you're not going to get more time, you basically have to ship with what you've got. So that could just be a case where working in a normal, healthy, sustainable way is actually not going to work, which of course can then mean that it's an unsustainable thing, because if you sustainably fail to ship a project on time, then yes, while you may have worked sustainably, the broader situation is not sustainable, therefore it goes to zero, you lose your job. Once again, Catch-22 is a great book. So when you have a high-pressure situation like that, some personality types, I'm probably one of them, will just say, all right, fuck it, this is going to be gnarly, but let's go. The thing is, if you do that too much, you can end up just doing yourself a bit of brain damage. And as Jason Schreier did point out as well, it can be very easy to mistake obligation for enthusiasm when, you know, in the case of Glenn, you're the guy who's controlling people's salaries, titles, employment status, and all of that.
Yeah, that's very accurate.
Not that much of that ended up mattering because they did in fact lose their jobs. After the game came out...
See? What am I telling you? Do not sacrifice yourself in the name of another.
And only sold 2 million copies rather than the 5 million Krafton was allegedly expecting. 32 staff from the around 200 were let go, and then only a few months later, Striking Distance's CFO, COO, and CEO, that's Glenn, they all left of their own accord, which does mean that the studio now is just doing things for Krafton, but the actual... you know, the management, they basically all just left. So you're probably looking at all this and thinking, my
Well, not like they were useful to begin with, so no loss.
God, why did any of this happen? Like, why did Krafton go so insane and pull the release forward by 3.5 months? Well, per Schofield, Krafton went public in August 2021, and that basically changed motivations. He says, we went public and it put an awful strain of the company on the board of directors and everyone else, and then they, as in Krafton, put the strain on us probably. Now, this is, of course, you know, stuff that is all obviously terrible in hindsight, but you can probably piece together how it happens. I mean, they go public, and then Krafton's leadership starts to become strained by needing to show shareholders that they're actually making money, that they are getting results now, especially at the end of their first full financial year as a publicly traded company. And perhaps that then led to pressures on Schofield as
The first year does matter, yeah, that's a big one.
the leader of Striking Distance. That maybe led to cutting the timeline to make sure the Callisto Protocol's launch sales would count for fiscal year 2022, and allegedly they were expecting 5 million sales, so if their plan had have worked, maybe things would have been fantastic. But of course, their plan was stupid and self-defeating. Now, if you're in America or the UK or many other countries, you might be thinking, but you're talking about the calendar year, not the fiscal year. No, not in Korea. Krafton's a Korean company, and the Korean fiscal year ends December 31st. So, remember the date and
What's the point in calling it a fiscal year then?
the framing that I
didn't actually know that. Huh. Yeah, I had no idea Korea actually has a fiscal year that's... What's the point of calling it a fiscal year?
gave to you earlier? Money in February or March would have been fine for many other companies, but Krafton wanted results in that fiscal year, and that is why it had to come out in December. Basically, money in December was more important to them than a better game in April, and that just all, of course, spiraled downhill and ended up killing this game. It is one C-suite decision made for short-term reasons that hurt everybody involved, of course, including and perhaps especially...
Again, knowing how the game ended, 2 more bosses, 3 more enemy types would literally not matter. The story was boring, the story was kind of shit, the gameplay was dull. If you're gonna tell me the story would have been better, more consistent, more interesting, and, you know, other things like that, then I would say, yeah, they probably ruined the game. But again, 2 bosses, who gives a shit? This is such nothingness.
Especially the C-suite. And I think that's the angle that almost makes it the most depressing. Like, you could understand if they did...
In any case, everyone's an idiot. Never trust anyone. That's pretty much the end that you should understand here. That was Bellier. Bye.